The call came on a Tuesday morning in March of 1989, and the man who received it was sitting in a folding chair outside a gym in Chatsworth, California, drinking black coffee from a paper cup and watching a sparrow work at a crack in the pavement. The gym had no sign above the door. It did not need one. The men who trained there knew where it was. And the men who did not know where it was were not the men who were meant to train there. The building was a converted machine shop, 40 feet wide and 60 feet deep, with rubber mats covering 2/3 of the concrete floor and iron weights resting along the far wall in rows of ascending silence. The windows were painted over. The light came from fluorescent tubes that buzzed at a frequency just below hearing. The man in the folding chair was 58 years old. He weighed 172 pounds. He was wearing a white t-shirt that had been washed enough times to go nearly transparent at the shoulders, a pair of dark jeans and running shoes that had not been new in some time. He had a cap pulled low over his eyes, and if you had walked past him on that morning without knowing, you would have placed him as a retired tradesman taking the sun, or perhaps a groundskeeper between rounds. You would not have stopped. You would not have looked twice. The man on the other end of the call was not sitting down. Mike Tyson was 22 years old. He was 5 feet 11 and weighed 218 pounds of something that did not have a precise name in the English language. Not muscle exactly, not mass exactly, but a kind of organized violence that lived in the body and waited. He had been undisputed heavyweight champion of the world for 8 months. He had knocked out 37 men, 26 of them before the end of the second round. He had never been knocked down. He had never been cut. He had never fought beyond the 7th round because there had never been a need to fight beyond the 7th round. What Tyson said on that call has been repeated in gyms from Las Vegas to Osaka for 35 years. And the words, depending on who is telling the story, have grown sharper and shorter with each retelling, the way objects do when viewed from a distance. The core of what he said was this, that he had heard Chuck Norris was considered a fighter, that he had heard people talked about karate the way people talked about boxing, that he would be in Los Angeles in 3 days, and that he wanted to understand, from close range, what karate was worth. What Tyson did not know, on that Tuesday morning in March, was that the man he was calling had been training in martial arts for 29 years. What he did not know was that the man he was calling had studied under Tang Soo Do masters in Korea, had won the World Professional Middleweight Karate Championship 6 consecutive times, had trained Navy SEALs, Green Berets, and members of the Secret Service in close quarters combat. What he did not know was that Chuck Norris had been asked a version of this question, the version that ends in a room, with no audience and no referees, more times than he could count, and that he had said yes to it more times than he had said no, and that the answer had never changed. Nobody in that phone call knew they were about to set in motion one of the most quietly witnessed and slowly traveled stories in the history of combat sport. In 17 seconds, in a converted machine shop in Chatsworth, California, everything Mike Tyson thought he understood about what a human body could do in a confined space would be revised. Stay with this until the end. Because what Tyson said when it was over, the 4 words he spoke to no one in particular while standing in the center of the room, those words went on to change the way he talked about fighting for the rest of his career. Mike Tyson arrived in Los Angeles on the morning of Thursday, March the 9th, 1989 on a flight from New York that landed at 6:42. He was met by a driver and 2 members of his entourage, and he arrived at the gym in Chatsworth at 9:16. He was wearing a black training jacket with the hood pulled up, black shorts and boxing shoes. He was not wearing hand wraps. He had considered bringing gloves and then decided against it, because this was not a boxing match and he understood that much. He had spent the flight reading. He had read 2 magazine profiles of Chuck Norris and a brief history of Tang Soo Do that one of his training team had printed and left in the seat pocket. He had watched, on a small portable player, 40 minutes of karate competition footage. What he saw in that footage had not impressed him in the way it was meant to impress. What he saw was men stepping back, men creating distance, men scoring on the outside and retreating. He had seen the same thing in some boxers. In his experience, men who stepped back were men who did not want to be close to him. He understood this. He found it reasonable. He also found it usable. At 9:21, Tyson entered the gym. There were 9 people inside. 2 of them were sparring on the far mat and did not stop. 3 were working on the weights along the wall. 1 was a woman with a clipboard seated on a bench near the door who looked up when Tyson entered and then looked back at the clipboard. 2 were standing together near the center of the room, speaking quietly. One of them was a man named Jim Antoniou, who had been a tournament director in Southern California karate circuits for 14 years and who had been invited, through a chain of calls Tyson was not entirely aware of, to be present this morning without any formal explanation being given to him. Antoniou would later say that he had been told only that something worth seeing was going to happen, and that he should bring nothing with him except his understanding of what he knew. The 9th person in the room was Chuck Norris. Norris was standing near the west wall with a cup of water. He was in the same white t-shirt, the same dark jeans, the same running shoes. He had set his cap on a shelf near the door when he came in, and his hair was flat where the cap had pressed it. He looked like a man who had been there for an hour already. He looked like a man who had been there for years. Tyson crossed the room and they shook hands. The exchange that followed was brief and has been reported in several versions. What is consistent across all accounts is that Tyson spoke first, and that what he said was something close to what he had said on the phone, that he respected Chuck Norris, that he was not here to start trouble, but that he had a genuine question, and that his genuine question was this: power, he said, was the truth of a fight, not speed, not technique, not distance. Power, a man who could hit harder than any other man alive was going to win the fight, regardless of the system. He had been told that karate was a system worth respecting. He wanted to know if that was true at full contact at close range, against the kind of power that had ended the professional ambitions of 37 men. He was not smiling when he said it. He was not hostile when he said it. He asked it the way a man with a genuine technical question asks it, directly, without decoration. Chuck Norris set his cup of water on the shelf. He did not speak immediately. The 2 men who had been sparring on the far mat had stopped. The 3 men at the weights had turned. Jim Antoniou, near the center of the room, had taken his hands out of his pockets and was standing very still. Norris said, "Show me what you mean." If you are watching this and you have followed this channel, you know what that line means. You know what comes after it. Make sure you are subscribed and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. Because what happens in the next 90 seconds of that morning is something that people in 11 countries have been repeating in gyms and training halls for 3 decades, and we want to know how far this story has traveled. They moved to the center of the mat. Tyson settled into his stance, the compact, chin down, shoulder rolled guard he had built over 15 years of daily work. His hands came up. His feet found the width he knew. He was not performing the stance. He was inside it the way a man is inside a coat that has been worn until it fits the body's exact shape. Norris stood at an angle. His hands were at the level of his sternum, open. His feet were quiet on the mat. He looked to the people in the room like a man who had just been asked something simple and was taking a moment to think about the answer. Jim Antoniou would later tell this story to a karate instructor in San Diego named Marcus Webb, who told it to his students over a period of 7 years before Webb committed it to paper in a privately circulated account. Antoniou said that what struck him, standing 12 feet from the 2 men, was not what he saw in either of their bodies. It was what he heard, which was almost nothing. The gym had gone to the particular kind of silence that a working room reaches, when everyone in it has stopped pretending they are doing something else. The woman with the clipboard had set the clipboard down. The first movement came from Tyson. He did not throw a punch. What he threw was a test, a short, lateral shift of his weight, a roll of the left shoulder forward, a pressure that every opponent he had ever faced had responded to in one of 2 ways: by stepping back, or by flinching in place. This movement, this opening gravity that Tyson applied, was not found in the rulebook of any boxing federation. It was something he had developed over 1,000 rounds of sparring, a kind of preface that told him, in the fraction of a second before any punch was thrown, what kind of man he was standing across from. Chuck Norris did not step back. He did not flinch. He moved 3 inches to his left and slightly forward. And the angle between the two men changed in a way that was almost invisible from the outside, but that rearranged the geometry of the space completely. He was closer than he had been, and he was at a position from which Tyson's right hand, the hand that had ended the ambitions of all 37 men, would have to travel further than it wanted to travel to arrive where it was going.
This was the first second. A fight is not two men hitting each other. A fight is a conversation about distance. And the first thing a man says in that conversation tells you everything about what he has practiced and what he believes. What Tyson said in that first second with that rolling shoulder pressure was, "I am coming to you, and you will tell me when to arrive."
What Norris said in his 3-inch lateral shift was, "I am already somewhere else." Second 2. Tyson's left hand came out, not a jab in the classical sense but a measuring touch, a calibration, the kind of lead hand work he used to establish range and to set the distance for what came after it. It crossed the space between them at a speed that Jim Antonio would later describe as something that should not have been possible at such close quarters, that it arrived in the space where Chuck Norris's face had been a third of a second earlier, without arriving at Chuck Norris's face. Norris had rolled his head 2 inches offline. Not back. Offline. The punch went past his ear. He could, Antonio would say, have bitten it. The two men at the far mat had not moved. One of them had his hand on the other's shoulder and had forgotten it was there. Second 3. This is the second that every person who was in that room on the morning of March the 9th, 1989, has returned to when they have told this story. Because it is the second that does not follow the logic of what they knew to be true about the physics of close quarters fighting. What happened in second 3 was that Chuck Norris, from a position closer to Mike Tyson than any man had been in a professional context in over 2 years, placed the flat of his right forearm across the line of Tyson's advancing elbow, not a block, not a deflection, but a placement, a setting of the arm the way a man sets a book on a shelf, and redirected the geometry of Tyson's weight in a direction that Tyson's weight had not intended to go. Tyson did not fall. Nothing so simple happened. What happened was that Tyson's body, which had been organized around a center of gravity aimed at Chuck Norris, found that the center of gravity no longer had a target to aim at, and for a period of time that Antonio would estimate at 3/4 of a second, and that the two former sparring partners near the far mat would estimate at longer, Mike Tyson was a man who had thrown his whole weight at a door that opened the wrong way. He reset, he stepped back, he squared his feet, he looked at Chuck Norris. Norris had not moved from where the arm placement had left him. He had not retreated, he had not advanced. He was standing in the same spot he had been standing in at the start of second 3, and his hands were still at sternum level, still open. He said nothing. Second 4 through 11. What followed has been told in different sequences by different witnesses, and the sequence matters less than the pattern, which was this: Tyson made 3 serious attempts to close the distance and deliver force, and each of the 3 attempts ended at the same place, which was the place just before force was delivered, the place where Tyson's body had found its line and its commitment and its target, and the target had already moved. Not far. Never dramatically. The kind of movement that, watching from 12 feet away, looked like a man swaying on his feet, like a man with a habit of leaning slightly in one direction, but the movement was never late, and the movement was always sufficient, and after the 3rd attempt Jim Antonio set both hands flat on his own thighs, and straightened up very slowly because he had just understood something. The woman with the clipboard was standing. The final movement was not a strike. It arrived in the 11th second, and it was built from everything that had happened in the 10 seconds before it. The 3-inch lateral shifts, the head roll, the forearm placement, the 3 redirections of weight. Chuck Norris moved forward for the first time, moved into the space where Tyson was resetting, and the movement he made with his right leg was the particular rising knee compression of a roundhouse kick assembled for targeting the midsection, assembled and committed and aimed, and then stopped, held, an inch from Tyson's ribcage, not touching, present, The room was entirely quiet. Norris held the position for 2 full seconds. Then he let the leg come down. He took 1 step back. He put his hands at his sides. He extended his right hand. Mike Tyson looked at the extended hand. He looked at it for a moment that the room contained without moving. Then he reached out and took it, and they shook, and Norris released the grip and stepped back. Tyson stood in the center of the mat. He was breathing normally. He had not been struck. He had not been harmed in any way. He had been shown something. And the thing he had been shown was not something he could name in the vocabulary he had. He said 4 words. He said them quietly. And he said them to the room rather than to any particular person in it. And the 4 words were, what was that though? It was not a question, exactly. It was more like a man saying aloud what he needed to remember. Jim Antoniou heard the 4 words. The woman with the clipboard heard them. The 2 former sparring partners at the far mat heard them. In the weeks that followed, as Antoniou told Marcus Webb and Webb told his students, and his students carried pieces of the account into gyms in San Diego and Phoenix, and later to Osaka and Sydney. The 4 words would sometimes become 6, and sometimes become a whole sentence, and sometimes disappear entirely, replaced by a silence that witnesses began to attribute to awe, which was a simpler and less accurate version of the truth. The truth was simpler than awe, and more durable. It was a man who understood force encountering a principle that did not argue with force. That did not resist force, that simply declined to be where force arrived. The 2 men talked for 40 minutes after that. Tyson sat on the bench near the wall and asked questions. He asked about the forearm placement in second 3. He asked about the lateral movement that was not retreat. He asked about the mechanics of the roundhouse compression that had ended the sequence. Norris answered each question in the flat, deliberate way he answered questions that deserved real answers, and the conversation was witnessed by Antoniou, and by one of the former sparring partners, a man named Dale Foley who had been training at the gym for 6 years, and who had developed the habit of arriving early enough to be present for things worth being present for. Foley would say, years later, that what struck him about the 40 minutes was not the content of the questions, which were technical and precise, but the posture of the man asking them. Tyson sat forward on the bench with his elbows on his knees. He was 22 years old and the most feared man in professional athletics, and he sat forward on a bench in a converted machine shop in Chatsworth, California, with his elbows on his knees like a student. Before Tyson left, he stood at the door for a moment and said, one more thing. He said that he had thought coming into the room that what he was going to find out was whether karate worked against boxing. He said that was the wrong question. He said the right question was what a man could do when someone was not where he aimed. Norris said, that is the only question. Tyson left. The driver was waiting at the curb. The gym returned to its sounds. Jim Antoniou walked to the shelf where Norris had set his cup of water, picked up the cup, and looked at it for a moment the way a man looks at an ordinary object after an extraordinary morning. Then he set it back down. He walked over to Norris, who was standing near the west wall again, and he put his hand briefly on Norris's shoulder, just the flat of the palm, for 2 seconds, the way a man confirms that what he saw was real, and then he let his hand fall and walked toward the door without saying anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said that the morning had not already said more plainly. That is the thing about a story like this one. It does not travel because it is loud, it travels because it is true, or because it carries the structure of something true, which in the end is what most of the stories we keep are carrying. Antoniou told Webb. Webb told 11 students over 7 years. The students carried pieces of it into other rooms in other cities. And in each room it shed some detail and picked up another, the way a stone shed its edges and picked up the color of the riverbed it rested in. By 2004, a version of the story had reached a dojo in Osaka, where an instructor told it as a parable about the difference between strength and principle. By 2011, a retired MMA coach in Brisbane referenced it in a training manual without being entirely certain where he had heard it. Mike Tyson, in a long interview given in 2007 to a sports journalist named Carl Hutchins, was asked about his study of martial arts outside of boxing. He said that early in his career he had spent time around practitioners of several disciplines.
He said that the most instructive encounter he could remember was with someone who he said had refused to give him a target. He did not name the man. He did not name the gym. He said only, I threw everything I had at the space he was in, and he wasn't in it. And I thought, that's a different problem than I've been thinking about. Hutchins asked if the encounter had changed how he trained.
Tyson said, "It changed how I thought about where a man has to be. The lesson, as it has traveled, has acquired different shapes. Some people tell it as a story about humility, which it is. Some people tell it as a story about the limits of raw power, which it also is. But the version that survives closest to what Jim Antonio saw on the mat in Chatsworth in March of 1989 is simpler than either of those. And it is this: that the question a man asks when he walks into a room tells you exactly what he thinks he is going to find. And that the answer to the question is almost never the thing the question prepared him for. A man who believes power is the final argument of a fight has never been in a fight where the other man simply was not there." Chuck Norris left the gym at 11:43. He picked his cap up from the shelf near the door, folded the brim once with both hands the way a man folds something that has served him well, set it on his head, and walked out into the March light. The Sparrow was still working at the crack in the pavement. The forklift in the yard across the street was moving a pallet of corrugated steel from one end of the lot to the other, indifferent to the morning, and to what the morning had held. Next week on this channel, we will tell you what happened on the afternoon in 1991 when Steven Seagal walked into a room in Hollywood and told a room full of stunt coordinators that no working martial artist in America could take a hit from him cleanly. We will tell you who was in that room. We will tell you what the stunt coordinator said before it started, and what Seagal said when it was over. And why the story was kept quiet for 11 years before the first person who was there finally decided that some things are too precisely true to keep to themselves. Leave a comment below, and tell us where you are watching from. This story has traveled further than the people in that gym in 1989 ever imagined it would. And we want to see how far it still has to go.